Great. Well, thank you, Catherine, for introducing everybody so well. It's one of my favourite things, just coming on these calls, which we've been doing now for a number of years, just hearing different folks describing their situations and where they're from. And as you said, Catherine, such a diversity of situations, and each of us grappling with shame. So fascinating. And as I hear you all speak, my sense of shame rises within me because I feel now the least qualified person in the room to be talking about the thing that I've just been exploring and thinking about. So all I'm going to do is sort of take a lid off probably a couple of pots and give you a sniff of the contents that I've been exploring. Which might frustrate some of you immensely because I'm not coming as an expert in any way, shape, or form on this topic. It's just something that's intrigued me. Let me tell you a little bit about myself for those of you who might be meeting me for the first time. So I lead a Pioneer Church, part of the Pioneer group of churches, I should say, which is one of the new church streams. I'm based here in St Albans. And have been doing that for now 25 years, along with, for most of that time, running a little charity called Cell UK with my good friend Lawrence Singlehurst, who, between us, we've written a number of little booklets to promote and encourage the idea of small groups in churches. What we believe is that is the foundational space where people get discipled and grow in their faith, but also are then encouraged to reach out and connect with others. So that's been happening for the last 20 years or so plus. And recently, for the last 10 years or so, I've been running a community pottery studio. Happened by accident, really, by discovering that a friend that worked in that little charity loved pottery just like me. And we found a little space and started creating together. So that's been good fun and has developed and grown and flourished. And we've seen lots of people overcome their shame in that context. I've also had the privilege of writing a book, something that I never thought I'd do. And certainly my English teacher would be absolutely amazed from my secondary school that happened. So Shame in the Gospel came out about 18 months ago or so now, and is a way of exploring how the gospel message of Jesus, that timeless message, connects with shame. We're used to it connecting with guilt. That's the bridge that it tends to cross in our Western culture. As somebody mentioned earlier, Brené Brown has put forward that shame is at epidemic proportions in our Western world. So how do we connect the gospel with people struggling with shame? That's the question that I try and answer, and I do that by highlighting the problem, but then also by looking at the bridge that we make with the gospel. What does the gospel look like into that context? But also describing what churches might need to look like to be shame resilient places as people come and join us or connect with us in any way, shape, or form. Talk a little bit about liturgy and use some of the work that Andrea has done around liturgy as well in that context. So that's a little bit about me, married with 4 grown-up children, which is fab. And somebody said earlier, once you start looking at shame, you see it everywhere. And it's a bit like, I describe it or think of it like buying a new car. We had for many years a Toyota Previa that all the family got taken around in, all of our 4 children and their friends. And then sadly, it had to go. A family friend, and I got a Citroen Berlingo, and I thought, oh, there's not many Citroen Berlingos around. But once you have one, you see them everywhere. There's one, there's another one, there's another one. And shame's a bit like that. It's hidden until you get to think about it and connect with it. A little bit about me. So what I've been exploring is, or thinking about, is the space of attachment theory. And I came across that initially in a book by this chap, Kurt Thompson, who also writes a book on shame. So Anatomy of the Soul, he's talking about the connection between spirituality, theology, and psychology, which a number of writers have been doing over a few years, and I've been interested in exploring that. And he mentions attachment theory and references Dallas Willard and Jim Wilder. So obviously, I then go and look at Jim Wilder and Dallas Willard. And as often happens in these situations, I then discover other people in conversations that I'm in that are reading similar things. And there seems to be a bubble in the Christian world at the moment, a sort of, things bubbling around this topic of attachment theory. I was particularly struck by the opening words in Renovated. So you need to write about this, Dallas said. His voice was steady, but with mounting passion. I know of no soteriology, that's the doctrine of salvation, based on forming a new attachment with God. He offered no arguments in favor or against the idea. Dallas, for all well as he knew history, could think of no previous proponents. His body slumped back into his chair, tired from the energy of speaking. And that's just a few months before, sadly, Dallas died. Jim Willard then picks up this theme of attachment theory and a soteriology, a way of thinking about how the death and resurrection of Jesus reconnects us relationally. And from my limited understanding, it is a very limited understanding, attachment is formed for us as children as we connect with those significant adults in our lives, and our relational world is then formed and based around those relationships. And many of us can think about how good that is, and for many of us, how flawed that was. And then that then forms to some degree a foundation for our relationship with others in the Christian community, but particularly plays its way out into our relationship with God. So to understand how well we're attached, and as Brené Brown says, we're designed for connectedness, as our Bible tells us, we're designed in the image of God, who in himself lives in relationship, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So anything we can discover that helps us with those relationships, I think it's good for us to look at. So this whole area of attachment theory, which has been looked at and developed, as far as I can see, over the last 30 years plus, so a relatively new area of exploration. And a number of writers have started writing about it, particularly its connection into the spiritual space. So I thought it'd be good for us to talk about that, particularly in light of shame, and in a number of ways, I suppose. One, in what does it mean for us as we think about the way that people are attached or not attached in relational ways, both to us and the people around us, as we work with them, as we connect with them, as we draw them closer to God, but also those in our Christian community who need that discipleship, who all of us together looking to grow and flourish in our relationships with each other and with God. I was very impacted a few years ago now by the work of Alan Kreider looking at the early church. And he tells the story of the early church and the catechism process that went on with the sponsor relationships that happened one-on-one, with people not being told to believe new things, but being encouraged to live completely different lives. And that happening in a very profound way in a culture that looks very similar to ours, that was pluralistic as it is now, was very similar in a number of respects. And they put a lot of work into these one-to-one relationships, which many of the neuroscientists would say was connecting them and rewiring their way of thinking and operating through mirror neurons, which are connected as we have conversations with each other, as we live life together. And indeed, as we think about Jesus doing that with the disciples, it was very much that transformational process that was going on. Our Western culture, particularly in light of the Reformation and the Enlightenment, has put a lot of emphasis on knowing and knowledge, and less emphasis on practice and actually life transformation. And I think what the attachment theory space highlights for us again is the need for relational transformation, for connection, and for that influence to occur. Somebody else that I found really, really helpful as I've looked at this, and I'm only part way through reading, I don't know whether you can see that through the camera, Attached to God by Crispin Mayfield. And he looks at what he describes as three attachment forms: an anxious attachment, where there's anxiety is the driver, fear is the driver for attachment, that unhealthy driver. All three of them are just to some degree unhealthy. Shutdown attachment, he does a little assessment in this book, which I did, and found myself in that shutdown attachment, not being as prepared to display my emotions as perhaps I could be or should be, often very logical, often very clinical, often very, detached in that sense. So shutdown attachment. And then one which will connect with us specifically on this call, which he describes as shame-filled attachment, just not feeling good enough, feeling completely inadequate. And he does a wonderful job of actually looking at each of those, writing a chapter around each of them, describing what we'll feel like in each of those spaces, and helping us discover how we can get beyond those things and build healthier and better relationships, both with God and with ourselves. What's encouraging about many of these writers is that, and particularly from Crispin, is that he says that we only need 60% good attachment relationships for us to be healthy. So if you're sat here thinking you didn't have a particularly good relationship with your parents or whoever the caregivers were as you grow up, then 60% is the level at which he suggests, and can be scientifically proved, I think, that we can be reasonably healthy. Now, obviously, there are going to be variants. The other thing I've discovered is that obviously many of us who've suffered trauma in our early childhoods will be further back in our relational connection. And Jim Wilder, particularly in his research, looks at how our subconscious is restricted in its development through traumatic experiences in our past, and how we can again be helped to overcome some of those things as part of our rediscovering wholeness and fullness in becoming better connected, both to those around us, but also in our relationship and understanding of God. So that's the sort of things I've been thinking about, the sort of things I've been looking at. I've always been intrigued with this area, having worked for so many years with people in small groups, been a great believer in people being in small groups, and that being the transformational space and place for us as Christians, because that's where the reality of life, if it's allowed to, can come to the surface. That's where we can have some authenticity, hopefully some openness and vulnerability, and some reshaping of the way that we act and respond. So I'm going to stop there, I think, because the danger is the more I say, the more you realize that I have very little clue about what I'm talking about. But I'm just intrigued and want to discover together, I guess, what our experiences are, whether we've seen this for ourselves, whether some of the things that I've shared just briefly now, you're thinking, oh yes, I've experienced that here or this here or that there. And what we describe this group as is a learning community, really, a space where we just come together and talk. And Andrea's going to lead us